What if I told you that while your family is calling you a disappointment behind closed doors, you actually control every aspect of their livelihood without them knowing it? What if the brother who mocks your ambitions works for a company you secretly own? What if the parents who question your life choices depend entirely on investments you've made? Today's story will show you exactly what happens when the family that underestimates you discovers they've been living under your financial umbrella all along. This is Maya Chen's story, and by the end, you'll understand why sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people discover the truth about who really holds the power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The notification sound on my laptop made my stomach twist with dread. Another email from Mom, probably asking about my weekend plans, or worse, suggesting I come to Tyler's promotion celebration dinner. I'd been dreading this day for weeks, knowing my family would gather to celebrate my older brother's latest achievement while I sat there pretending to be proud. Don't get me wrong, I love Tyler, but watching my parents beam with pride over his modest sales promotion while completely dismissing my actual business success had become exhausting. I was sitting in my downtown Denver office, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Rocky Mountains, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Tyler's name, which was unusual since we typically only texted. I figured he was calling to personally invite me to his celebration dinner, maybe throw in some gentle teasing about how I needed to get out more and stop being so focused on work. I answered on the third ring, already preparing my enthusiastic congratulations. "Hey Tyler, congrats on the promotion. I heard from Mom that I started," but I was cut off by voices in the background. Tyler wasn't talking to me at all. I could hear him clearly, but he was speaking to someone else entirely. My finger hovered over the end call button, but something in his tone made me pause. He sounded different, more confident than usual, almost boastful. "Yeah, my sister Maya thinks she's so smart with her little investment hobby." Tyler's voice came through crystal clear. "Dad was just telling me yesterday how worried they are about her. She's 29 and still acts like she's building some empire or something. It's honestly embarrassing." My blood went cold. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, my hand trembling slightly. This wasn't a conversation I was meant to hear, but I couldn't bring myself to hang up. Another voice joined in, someone I didn't recognize, probably a coworker. "Really? She seems pretty driven though, right? Isn't that a good thing?" Tyler laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. "Driven toward what exactly? She sits in that tiny apartment all day, claims she's running some big business, but we've never seen any proof. Mom thinks she's just day trading or something equally ridiculous. Dad says she's living in a fantasy world, pretending to be important when she's basically unemployed." The unknown voice seemed hesitant. "But doesn't she have money? I thought your parents mentioned she helps out financially sometime." "Oh, please," Tyler scoffed, and I could practically hear him rolling his eyes. "She throws a few $100s our way now and then, acting like she's the family financial advisor. Meanwhile, I'm actually climbing the corporate ladder at a real company, making real money, building a real career. The difference is, I don't have to brag about it or pretend I'm some big-shot CEO." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Every word was a knife, cutting deeper than anything I'd ever heard from my family before. But Tyler wasn't finished. "The worst part is how she acts at family gatherings," he continued. "Always checking her phone, talking about business calls and investment opportunities. We all just play along because we feel bad for her, but honestly, it's getting pathetic. She's turning 30 soon and still living in this delusion that she's going to be some major success story." The other person made some non-committal sound, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Don't get me wrong, I love my sister," Tyler added, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but somebody needs to give her a reality check. Dad's been saying for months that maybe we should stage some kind of intervention. Help her understand that it's okay to have a normal job like normal people. This whole entrepreneur act is just embarrassing at this point." I realized I was holding my breath. My own brother, the person I'd looked up to growing up, was discussing me like I was a charity case, like I was delusional, like everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, was just an elaborate fantasy that the family tolerated out of pity. The conversation was winding down, Tyler moving on to talk about his promotion and the celebration dinner. I finally found the strength to end the call, my hands shaking as I set the phone down on my desk. The silence in my office felt overwhelming. For several minutes, I just sat there, staring out at the Denver skyline, trying to process what I'd just heard. Here's what Tyler and my parents didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about or investigate. Summit Ventures LLC, the company I'd founded 4 years ago, wasn't some hobby or fantasy. It was a multi-million-dollar investment firm specializing in commercial real estate and strategic business acquisition. I owned 12 properties across the Denver metro area, had controlling interests in 6 different companies, and employed over 40 people indirectly through my various holdings. More importantly, and more ironically than Tyler could possibly imagine, Summit Ventures was the primary investor in TechFlow Solutions, the very company where Tyler worked, the company he was so proud to be promoted with, the company that employed him, paid his salary, and provided his health insurance was owned, in large part by his supposedly delusional little sister. It had started 3 years ago when TechFlow was struggling financially, looking for investors to avoid bankruptcy. My financial advisor, Jennifer Walsh, had brought me the opportunity as part of a portfolio of distressed tech companies. The numbers looked good, the management team seemed competent, and the price was right. I'd invested through Colorado Property Holdings, one of my shell companies, to maintain anonymity. Most of my business dealings were conducted this way, keeping my personal name out of public records and allowing me to operate without the complications of family dynamics. I'd had no idea Tyler worked there when I made the investment. It was pure coincidence that he'd landed a job at TechFlow 6 months after my company had essentially saved it from bankruptcy. When he excitedly told the family about his new position, I'd nearly choked on my coffee, but I'd kept quiet, partly because the investment was performing well, and partly because I knew Tyler would never believe me if I told him. Now, sitting in my office after overhearing his true opinion of me, I realized just how deep the irony ran. Tyler was celebrating a promotion at a company that existed because of my money, my business decisions, my success. He was building his career on the foundation I'd provided, all while mocking my ambitions to anyone who would listen. I opened my laptop and pulled up the TechFlow file. According to the latest reports Jennifer had sent me, the company was doing exceptionally well. The investment I'd made had not only stabilized their operations, but had funded the expansion that created Tyler's new position. In a very real sense, I'd inadvertently funded my own brother's promotion while he disparaged my accomplishments behind my back. The worst part wasn't even Tyler's betrayal, though that stung deep. It was the realization that my entire family saw me as a failure, as someone living in denial about my own mediocrity. They'd been humoring me for years, playing along with what they believed was an elaborate delusion about my business success. Every time I'd tried to share my achievements, every time I'd mentioned a successful deal or a new property acquisition, they'd been exchanging looks behind my back, treating me like a child playing dress-up. I thought about all the family dinners where I'd held back from talking about my work, sensing their discomfort but misunderstanding the cause. I'd thought they were intimidated by my success, maybe feeling awkward because I was doing well while they struggled financially. I'd never imagined they simply didn't believe my success was real. The irony was overwhelming. While Tyler worked his way up from junior sales associate to senior sales associate, celebrating modest commission increases and small promotions, I'd been building an empire. While my parents worried about their mortgage payments and retirement savings, I'd been accumulating wealth that could have solved all their financial concerns permanently. While they all pitied my supposed delusions of grandeur, I'd been living the reality they couldn't even imagine. But I'd hidden it all, kept my success private, operated behind shell companies and legal entities specifically to avoid this kind of family drama. I'd wanted to build something substantial before revealing the full scope of my achievement. I'd planned to surprise them eventually, maybe at a family gathering or special occasion, showing them that their youngest member had actually accomplished something significant. Now I realized that strategy had backfired completely. My discretion had been interpreted as deception, my privacy seen as evidence that there was nothing real to hide. They'd constructed an entirely false narrative about my life, one where I was a struggling wannabe entrepreneur, rather than an actual successful business owner. The phone rang again, startling me out of my thoughts. This time it was Jennifer Walsh, my financial advisor and the only person who knew the full extent of my holdings. "Maya, I've got the quarterly reports ready for review," she said, her voice bright and professional. "Summit Ventures is up 18% this quarter, largely thanks to the TechFlow performance. That investment keeps paying dividends." "Jennifer," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears, "I need to ask you something. How much of TechFlow do we actually own?" There was a pause as I heard her typing. "Let me pull up the exact numbers. Through Colorado Property Holdings and the subsidiary investments, Summit Ventures controls approximately 67% of TechFlow Solution. You're essentially the majority owner, though the company operates independently through their existing management structure." 67%. I owned more than half of my brother's company, the place where he was so proud to work, so excited to build his career. I was, in effect, his boss's boss's boss, though neither he nor anyone at TechFlow knew it. "Why do you ask?" Jennifer continued. "Is there an issue with the TechFlow investment?" I almost laughed, but it came out more like a sob. "No issue with the investment. I just discovered that my brother works there, and he's been telling people I'm a failed entrepreneur living in a fantasy world." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. "Your brother doesn't know about Summit Ventures. Nobody in my family knows." I admit, I wanted to keep business and family separate, avoid complications, but it turns out they think I'm unemployed, just playing around with day trading or something equally insignificant. "Maya," Jennifer said gently, "you realize you could buy and sell most of the companies their friends work for, right? You're not just successful, you're exceptionally successful for someone your age. Why haven't you told them?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself for the past hour. Why had I hidden my success so completely that my own family thought I was a failure? Part of it was genuinely wanting to avoid family drama, to prevent relatives from asking for money or treating me differently. Part of it was wanting to prove myself completely before revealing anything, to have such undeniable success that no one could question or diminish it. But sitting there in my office, looking out at a city where I owned millions of dollars worth of real estate, I realized there was a deeper reason. I'd been afraid that even my success wouldn't be enough for them, that they'd find ways to minimize or dismiss whatever I accomplished. So I'd kept quiet, building my empire in secret, telling myself I was being smart and Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, I'd created a situation where my family saw my discretion as evidence of failure. They'd filled in the blanks with their own assumptions, and those assumptions painted me as exactly the kind of person I'd worked so hard not to be: unsuccessful, delusional, and dependent on their tolerance. The worst part was that I couldn't even be angry at them for thinking these things, because I'd given them no evidence to the contrary. I'd been so focused on avoiding their judgment that I'd inadvertently invited. By hiding my success, I'd allowed them to construct a narrative where I had no success to hide. As I sat there processing this revelation, another thought occurred to me. Tyler's promotion celebration dinner was this weekend. The whole family would be there, toasting his advancement at a company I owned. They'd probably make subtle jokes about my absence from the real working world, maybe suggest I could learn something from Tyler's work ethic and career focus. The idea of sitting through that dinner, pretending to be impressed by Tyler's promotion while knowing I'd essentially funded it myself, felt unbearable. But the alternative, revealing the truth about my business holdings, felt equally daunting. How do you tell your family that you've been pretending to be unsuccessful while actually being more successful than any of them imagined? How do you explain that their pity has been misplaced, that their concern has been unnecessary, that their assumptions have been completely wrong? I realized I was at a crossroads. I could continue hiding my success, attending family gatherings as the pitied underachiever, listening to their well-meaning advice about getting a real job and building a stable career, or I could find a way to reveal the truth, to show them exactly who they'd been dismissing and underestimating. The decision felt overwhelming, but as I looked around my office, at the contracts and financial statements and property deeds that represented years of hard work and strategic thinking, I knew I couldn't keep living this double life. My family deserved to know the truth, even if that truth was uncomfortable for all of us. But more than that, I deserved to stop pretending to be less than I was. I'd built something remarkable, something I should be proud of, rather than ashamed of. The fact that my success had been invisible to my family wasn't a failure on my part. It was simply the result of a strategy that had outlived its usefulness. As I started planning how to handle Tyler's celebration dinner, I had no idea that the revelation would come sooner than I expected, and in a way I never could have anticipated. Sometimes the truth has its own timeline, and sometimes the universe has a sense of irony that rivals even the most carefully planned revenge. The days following Tyler's accidental call felt like living in an alternate reality. Every interaction with my family took on new meaning. Every casual comment, now loaded with implications I'd never noticed before. When Mom texted asking if I was eating enough, I wondered if she really meant, "Can you afford groceries?" When Dad asked about my weekend plans, I heard the underlying concern that I didn't have a real job to structure my time around. The most painful part was recognizing the pattern that had been there all along. Family gatherings, where conversations shifted uncomfortably when I mentioned work meetings, the way my parents exchanged glances when I talked about business trips, Tyler's habit of changing the subject whenever I brought up a successful deal or new opportunity. I'd attributed their reactions to modesty or maybe even jealousy, never imagining they simply didn't believe any of it was real. I found myself replaying years of conversations with fresh perspective, seeing how my family had been managing what they perceived as my delusion. The time I mentioned acquiring a new property and Mom responded with, "That's nice, honey," in the same tone she'd used to humor a child's imaginary friend. The Christmas, when I gave everyone generous gifts, and Dad asked if I was managing my money responsibly. The countless occasions when Tyler would redirect conversations about my work toward his own career updates. What I'd thought was sibling rivalry now revealed as damage control. The weight of their pity was crushing in a way their genuine concern never could have been. Knowing that every family interaction had been filtered through their belief that I was failing, that they'd been protecting my feelings while discussing my supposed shortcomings behind my back, felt like discovering that my entire adult relationship with them had been built on false premises. But, perhaps the most devastating realization, was how deeply their lack of faith had affected my own behavior. I'd been unconsciously scaling back my excitement about achievements, downplaying successes, and avoiding detailed discussions about my work. Not because I was being humble, but because I'd sensed their discomfort and misinterpreted it as awkwardness around my success, rather than skepticism about its existence. I started noticing how isolated I'd become in my professional life. While other successful people my age shared their wins with family, celebrated milestones with relatives, and integrated their personal and professional identities, I'd been compartmentalizing everything. Summit Ventures had employees who respected me, clients who valued my expertise, and competitors who considered me a serious player in the Denver investment scene. But none of that had translated into my family relationships, because I'd kept those worlds completely separate. The irony was that my secrecy, intended to protect my family from potential complications, had instead created the impression that there was nothing worth protecting. By operating through shell companies and maintaining my privacy, I'd inadvertently validated their assumption that my business claims were exaggerated or entirely fictional. Jennifer called on Thursday to discuss the quarterly investor meeting, and I found myself asking questions I'd never considered before. How do other clients handle family dynamics around their wealth? I asked, feeling embarrassed by the question, but needing to understand if my situation was unusual. Most successful people deal with family complications around money, she said thoughtfully. But usually it's the opposite problem: relatives who want financial help or who treat them differently because of their wealth. Your situation is more unusual because you've essentially hidden your success so completely that your family doesn't know it exists. She paused, and I could hear her typing in the background. Maya, can I ask why you've been so determined to keep Summit Ventures private? Even successful people who value privacy usually have their immediate family aware of their general financial situation. The question forced me to examine motivations I'd never really articulated. I wanted to prove myself completely before telling them anything, I admitted. I didn't want them to worry about me asking for help or changing family dynamics around money. And honestly, I was afraid that even if I was successful, they'd find ways to minimize it or make it seem less significant. And now I realize that by trying to avoid their judgment, I invited worse judgment. They think I'm delusional instead of just success. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. The tech flow situation complicates things, doesn't it? Your brother doesn't just work at some random company, he works at a company you essentially own. That's going to come out eventually, especially if he continues advancing there. She was right, and the thought had been keeping me awake at night. Tyler's promotion celebration was scheduled for Saturday, and I'd been debating whether to attend. The idea of sitting through dinner while he and my parents discussed his promising career at a company I'd saved from bankruptcy felt surreal, but not attending would likely confirm their beliefs about my antisocial tendencies and inability to handle normal family situations. More concerning was the long-term sustainability of the secret. TechFlow was performing well largely due to the strategic guidance and financial backing I'd provided through Summit Venture. If Tyler continued advancing in the company, eventually he'd reach levels where he might encounter information about the ownership structure. Senior management knew about the Colorado Property Holdings investment, though they didn't know my personal identity. But as Tyler climbed higher, the chance of him discovering the connection would increase. I realized I was facing an impossible choice: continue hiding my success and maintain the status quo where my family pitied me, while unknowingly benefiting from my achievements, or reveal the truth and deal with the complicated aftermath of years of deception. Neither option felt satisfying, and both carried significant risks to family relationships I still valued, despite recent revelations. The weekend approached with mounting anxiety. I'd confirmed my attendance at Tyler's celebration dinner, partly because missing it would generate more family concern and partly because I needed to see how this dynamic played out in person, now that I understood what was really happening. But I also found myself hoping for some kind of catalyst, some event that might naturally reveal the truth without requiring me to make an awkward announcement. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected complication. Rachel Kim, my assistant, knocked on my office door with an expression I couldn't quite read. Maya, there's someone here to see you, David Morrison from TechFlow Solutions. He says he's here about a potential business partnership, but he didn't have an appointment. David Morrison was Tyler's boss, the VP who'd been mentioned in several TechFlow reports I'd reviewed. I'd never met him personally, since all my interactions with TechFlow had been conducted through Jennifer and legal representatives. His presence in my office felt like worlds colliding in exactly the way I'd been trying to avoid. Did he say what kind of partnership? I asked, buying time while trying to figure out how to handle this unexpected development. Something about expanding TechFlow's client services division. He mentioned hearing about Summit Ventures through industry contacts and wanted to explore collaboration opportunities. This was problematic on multiple levels. If David Morrison was here to discuss business partnerships, it meant he'd researched Summit Ventures enough to identify me as the principal owner. But his casual manner suggested he didn't know about my family connection to Tyler. The situation felt like a carefully balanced house of cards that could collapse with one wrong move. Give me 5 minutes, then send him in, I said, using the time to review TechFlow's organizational chart and David Morrison's background. According to the files, he'd been with the company for 8 years, starting before my investment and working his way up to VP of Sales and Business Development. He was Tyler's direct supervisor and had been instrumental in the company's recent growth. When David entered my office, he was exactly what I'd expected from his corporate headshot: mid-40s, confident demeanor, expensive suit that suggested he was doing well in his role. He shook my hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to making important business deals. Ms. Chen, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I know how busy you must be. His tone was respectful but not deferential, The approach of someone who recognized he was meeting with a peer rather than someone he needed to impress. Of course, Mr. Morris. Rachel mentioned you wanted to discuss a potential partnership between our companies. He settled into the chair across from my desk, pulling out a leather portfolio. TechFlow has been expanding our consulting services, and we're looking for strategic partners who understand the Denver market. Your reputation in commercial real estate and business investments has come up repeatedly in our research. I managed to keep my expression neutral, though internally I was calculating how much he might know about Summit Ventures' involvement with his company. I appreciate the interest. What kind of partnership did you have in mind? We're specifically looking at developing integrated solutions for our clients, companies that need both technology consulting and strategic investment guidance. From what I understand, Summit Ventures has expertise in exactly those areas. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with David outlining TechFlow's expansion plans and potential collaboration opportunity. He was clearly intelligent and well prepared, discussing market analysis and strategic positioning with the fluency of someone who understood the business landscape. I found myself genuinely impressed by his vision for the company's growth, which made the underlying irony even more complex. Here was Tyler's boss, the person responsible for my brother's recent promotion, sitting in my office and treating me as a respected business leader whose partnership he actively sought. Meanwhile, Tyler had spent weeks telling anyone who would listen that I was an unemployed dreamer living in denial about my own mediocrity. As our conversation wound down, David made a comment that stopped my heart. You know, it's interesting that you're in Denver. I have a colleague whose sister lives here and claims to run some kind of investment company. He's always a bit embarrassed about it because she tends to exaggerate her business success, but maybe there are more legitimate opportunities in this market than he realizes. The room felt like it was spinning. There was no doubt he was talking about Tyler and me, though he clearly didn't realize the connection. Tyler had been discussing my supposed delusions with his boss, the very person who was now sitting in my office, seeking a business partnership with the company he didn't believe existed. That's fascinating, I managed to say, my voice sounding surprisingly steady. The investment landscape in Denver has definitely grown in recent years. There might be more legitimate operators than your colleague realizes. David nodded, completely unaware of the bombshell he'd just dropped. Exactly my thinking, which is why I wanted to reach out to established firms like Summit Ventures rather than taking his word that the whole sector is full of wannabes and pretenders. After he left, promising to send over formal partnership proposals and requesting a follow-up meeting the next week, I sat in my office trying to process what had just happened. Tyler hadn't just been dismissing my career to family members, he'd been actively undermining my professional reputation with his boss, describing me as someone who exaggerated business achievements and lived in fantasies about success. The betrayal felt even deeper now. It was one thing for Tyler to express private doubts about my career to our parents, but actively discouraging his boss from taking Denver's investment community seriously because of his assumptions about my failures crossed into professional sabotage. He'd been so confident in his assessment of my supposed delusions that he'd used me as an example of why his boss shouldn't waste time exploring the local market. Meanwhile, that same boss had just spent an hour in my office discussing potential partnerships worth millions of dollars, treating me with the respect and professionalism that Tyler apparently believed I didn't deserve. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. I realized that tomorrow's celebration dinner had just become exponentially more complicated. David Morrison would likely mention his visit to Summit Ventures when discussing TechFlow's expansion plans, since Tyler was part of the sales team that would be involved in any new partnership. Tyler would hear about his boss meeting with a local investment firm owner named Maya Chen, and unless he was completely oblivious, he'd eventually connect the dots. But there was something else, something that felt like the universe delivering poetic justice. Tyler's promotion celebration was happening at Romano's Italian restaurant, a place I knew well because Summit Ventures owned the building. I'd acquired the property 2 years ago as part of a downtown revitalization investment, and Romano's was one of 3 businesses operating as tenants in the building. The irony was becoming almost too perfect to believe. Tyler would be celebrating his promotion at a company I owned, in a restaurant located in a building I owned, after his boss had spent the afternoon in my office, seeking business partnerships, all while my family maintained their belief that I was an unemployed dreamer whose business claims were elaborate fantasies. As I prepared to leave the office, I made a decision that surprised me. Instead of dreading tomorrow's dinner or trying to avoid the inevitable revelation, I was going to embrace it. Tyler had spent years undermining my credibility, both privately with family and professionally with colleagues. He'd been so certain of my failure that he'd used me as a cautionary tale about delusional entrepreneurs. Tomorrow night, he was going to discover exactly how wrong he'd been, and I was going to enjoy every moment of his realization. The drive home gave me time to think about strategy. Simply announcing my business success at dinner would come across as defensive and potentially vindictive, especially given the years of secrecy. But the David Morrison situation provided a natural opening, a way for the truth to emerge, organically rather than through dramatic revelation. I decided to attend the dinner exactly as planned, act normally, and wait for Tyler to mention TechFlow's expansion plans or his boss's recent meetings. When he inevitably brought up David Morrison's visit to some local investment firm, I could casually reveal that I was the firm owner David had met with. The truth would unfold naturally, and Tyler would have to reconcile his assumptions about my career with the reality of his boss's professional respect for my business. But I also realized this revelation would fundamentally change family dynamics in ways I couldn't predict. Once my parents and Tyler learned about Summit Ventures, they'd have to confront years of misunderstanding and misplaced concern. They'd realize that while they'd been worrying about my financial stability and career prospects, I'd been building a business empire that included Tyler's own workplace. The power dynamic would shift completely. Instead of being the family member they pitied and protected, I'd become the one with the most influence and resources. That transition could improve our relationships by giving them a more accurate understanding of my life, or it could create new complications around money, expectations, and family obligation. More immediately, Tyler would have to face the fact that his recent promotion had been funded, indirectly, by the sister whose business acumen he'd been questioning. The company he was so proud to work for, the career advancement he'd been celebrating, the professional opportunities he'd been building his future around, all of it existed because of investments I'd made and strategic decisions I'd implemented. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp Colorado weather that usually lifted my mood, but today I felt the weight of impending change. By tomorrow, my family would know the truth about my business success, and there would be no going back to the comfortable anonymity I'd maintained for years. I spent the morning reviewing TechFlow files, partly for business reasons and partly to prepare for conversations that might arise at dinner. The quarterly reports showed continued strong performance, with Tyler's sales division exceeding targets by 15%. His promotion had been well-deserved based on objective metrics, which made the situation even more complex. He'd earned his advancement through legitimate professional achievement, but he'd done it at a company that existed because of my financial backing. As afternoon approached, I found myself looking forward to the evening with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The revelation would be uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it would also finally allow me to stop pretending to be less successful than I actually was. After years of hiding my achievements to avoid family complications, I was ready to deal with whatever complications the truth might bring. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Tyler had been so concerned about my supposed delusions of business success that he'd inadvertently created the perfect opportunity for me to demonstrate exactly how real those achievements were. His boss's visit to my office, his upcoming celebration at a restaurant in my building, his promotion at a company I owned, every element of his professional life was connected to the business success he'd been dismissing as fantasy. Tomorrow's dinner would prove that sometimes the family member everyone underestimates is actually the one controlling everything from behind the scenes. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of nervous energy that precedes life-changing events. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror choosing an outfit that would strike the right balance between understated and professional. Too casual and I'd reinforce my family's perception of me as someone without serious career obligation. Too formal and I'd seem like I was overcompensating or trying too hard to appear important. I settled on a navy blazer over dark jeans. Expensive but not flashy, the kind of outfit that suggested success without demanding attention. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was strategically dressing to reveal my professional identity to people who should have known it already. Most families don't require wardrobe planning to acknowledge their daughter's career achievements, but most families also don't spend years believing those achievements are elaborate fantasy. The drive to Romano's took me through downtown Denver, past several properties I owned through various investment entities. The sight of these buildings, their rental income contributing to my monthly revenue, felt surreal given where I was headed. In 30 minutes, I'd be sitting at a table with people who believed I was struggling financially, celebrating my brother's modest promotion while unaware that I could probably buy the company he worked for outright if I chose to. Romano's occupied the ground floor of a restored brick building I'd purchased during the downtown revitalization boom. The property had been a smart investment, located in an area that was transitioning from neglected industrial space to trendy dining and entertainment district. Romano's had been the anchor tenant that made the acquisition attractive, a family-owned restaurant with strong local reputation and steady business. As I walked through the entrance, I noticed details I'd reviewed in property management reports, but never experienced firsthand. The exposed brick walls, restored hardwood floors and carefully maintained vintage fixtures created exactly the kind of atmosphere that drew customers and justified premium rent prices. The investment had been as much about preserving Denver's architectural character as generating returns, though it had certainly accomplished both objectives. The hostess led me toward the back dining room where my family had reserved space for Tyler's celebration. I could hear their voices before I saw them, Mom's excited chatter mixing with Dad's more measured tones and Tyler's confident laughter. The sound hit me differently now, knowing what they really thought of my life and career. What had once seemed like comfortable family conversation now felt like a performance I'd been unknowingly excluded from. Tyler spotted me first, standing to give me the kind of enthusiastic hug that suggested genuine affection despite everything I'd overheard. I was starting to worry you'd gotten lost in one of your important business meetings, he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The comment that might have seemed like playful teasing a week ago now carried undertones of mockery disguised as brotherly concern. Sorry I'm a few minutes late, I replied, accepting hugs from my parents and settling into the chair they'd saved for me. I had to finish up some client calls before leaving the office. Mom immediately jumped in with the kind of concerned questioning I now recognized as damage control. Oh honey, you work too hard. It's Saturday evening. Surely your clients understand that you need time for family. Her tone carried the gentle condescension of someone humoring what they believed was a harmless delusion about having important clients who required weekend attention. Dad nodded in agreement, his expression mixing paternal concern with barely concealed skepticism. Your mother's right, Maya. Work-life balance is important, especially when you're just starting out in business. You don't want to burn yourself out before you've really established yourself. The assumption that I was just starting out after 4 years of building Summit Ventures felt like a slap, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. They genuinely believed they were offering helpful guidance to their struggling daughter, protecting me from the embarrassment of acknowledging that my business claims might be exaggerated. Tyler jumped back into the conversation with the kind of energy that suggested he'd been waiting to share news. Actually, speaking of work, I've got some interesting updates about TechFlow's expansion plan. David Morrison, my boss, has been exploring new partnership opportunities in the Denver market. My heart rate increased, but I kept my voice casual. That sounds promising. What kind of partnerships is he looking into? Business consulting and strategic investment collaborations, Tyler said, his chest puffing slightly with pride at being included in high-level company discussions. Apparently there are some legitimate investment firms in Denver that he's been researching. I was actually surprised, because I'd always thought the local business scene was pretty small-time. The comment stung, but I realized Tyler had just provided the perfect opening for revelation. Really? Which firms has he been looking at? Tyler shrugged, clearly not considering this information particularly important. I don't remember all the names, but he mentioned meeting with someone from Summit Ventures this week, some woman who owns a commercial real estate and investment company. David seemed pretty impressed with their portfolio and market knowledge. The moment hung in the air like a held breath. Tyler had just described meeting with me without realizing it, praising my business knowledge and professional reputation while still believing I was unemployed and delusional about my own success. The cognitive dissonance was so perfect it almost seemed scripted. Mom looked confused. Summit Ventures? Is that a big company? I've never heard of it. It's apparently pretty well established in the Denver investment community, Tyler said, warming to his subject. David said they own properties throughout the metro area and have backing for significant commercial deals. He's hoping to set up some kind of partnership where TechFlow provides the technology consulting and they handle the investment and development side. I could feel the weight of the moment, the perfect opportunity to reveal the truth. But I wanted Tyler to fully commit to his assessment before dropping the bombshell. What did you think of his plan to work with them? Tyler's expression grew more animated. Honestly, I think it's brilliant. TechFlow needs partners who actually understand business and finance, people with real credentials and proven track records. Too many wannabe entrepreneurs around here think they're bigger deals than they actually are, but David's smart enough to identify the legitimate play. The irony was becoming almost too much to bear. Tyler was enthusiastically praising a partnership with my company, while simultaneously reinforcing his belief that I wasn't capable of legitimate business success. He was literally describing me as exactly the kind of person he believed I pretended to be. Dad looked interested. So this Summit Ventures must be pretty successful if Tyler's company wants to partner with them. Definitely, Tyler replied. David wouldn't waste time with anyone who wasn't established and credible. He mentioned that the owner has been building their portfolio for years, really knows the Denver market inside and out. It's exactly the kind of professional relationship that can take TechFlow to the next level. I realized I couldn't let this continue much longer without the revelation becoming cruel rather than illuminating. Tyler was genuinely excited about his company's prospects, and I didn't want to humiliate him in front of our parents. But I also couldn't sit there listening to him praise my business acumen while maintaining his belief that I lacked any business acumen whatsoever. Tyler, I said carefully, what was the name of the woman David met with, the Summit Ventures owner? He paused, clearly trying to remember details that hadn't seemed important when David first mentioned them. I think it was something Asian, maybe Chinese. David said she was young for someone with that kind of business portfolio, probably early 30s. The description hung in the air. Mom and Dad were listening with polite interest, not making any connections. Tyler continued to look thoughtful, still not processing the obvious implications. Did David mention her first name? I pressed gently. Tyler's brow furrowed with concentration. Maya something, I think. Maya Chen, maybe. Why do you ask? The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Tyler's expression change as the pieces slowly clicked into place, his confident smile fading into confusion, and then dawning realization. Mom and Dad looked back and forth between us, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. Maya Chen, Tyler repeated slowly, his voice losing its earlier enthusiasm. Summit Ventures, commercial real estate and investment company. I nodded, keeping my expression calm and letting him work through the implications himself. The revelation needed to come from his own recognition rather than my announcement, both for maximum impact and to avoid seeming vindictive. That's impossible, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. You're Maya Chen, but you're not. I mean, you don't actually own Summit Ventures, I finished quietly. Actually, I do. I founded the company 4 years ago. We specialize in commercial real estate acquisition and strategic business investments throughout the Denver metro area. Dad was the first to find his voice. Maya, what are you talking about? You don't own a real estate company. The disbelief in his tone was so absolute that it almost made me doubt my own reality. For a moment I understood how truly deep their conviction was that my business claims were fantasy. They weren't just skeptical. They were genuinely incapable of believing that I could be successful enough to own the kind of company Tyler had been describing. I do. Summit Ventures LLC is registered with the state of Colorado, fully licensed for commercial real estate and investment activities. We have offices in downtown Denver and manage a portfolio worth approximately $15 million. The numbers seemed to physically impact Tyler, who slumped back in his chair as if I'd pushed him. $15 million. Maya, that's not possible. You live in a small apartment. You drive a Honda. I live modestly by choice, I interrupt, and the Honda is reliable and fuel efficient. Successful business owners don't always drive luxury cars or live in mansions, especially when they're focused on reinvesting profits for growth. Mom was shaking her head slowly, her expression mixing confusion with something that might have been hurt. Honey, if this were true, why wouldn't you have told us? Why would you let us worry about your career and your future? The question cut to the heart of everything I'd been grappling with since Tyler's accidental phone call. Why had I hidden my success so completely that my own family thought I was failing? The reasons that had seemed logical 4 years ago now felt inadequate and potentially cruel. I wanted to keep business and family separate, I said, knowing it sounded weak even as I said it. I was afraid that mixing money and family relationships would create complications, so I decided to build the business quietly and tell you when I felt more established. Tyler's voice was barely above a whisper. David Morrison met with you. My boss spent an hour in your office discussing partnerships with TechFlow. He did. We had a very productive conversation about potential collaboration opportunity. He's clearly intelligent and has impressive vision for the company's growth, but when he mentioned meeting with a local investment firm owner, I told him not to waste his time because most of the entrepreneurs in Denver are just wannabes and pretenders, Tyler said, his face going pale as he realized what he'd done. The admission hung in the air, confirming what I'd suspected about Tyler's professional undermining of my reputation. He'd been so confident in his assessment of my supposed failures that he'd actively discouraged his boss from taking the local investment community seriously. You told your boss not to work with legitimate Denver investment firms because you assumed they were all like me, I asked, keeping my voice level despite the hurt I felt. Tyler couldn't meet my eyes. I didn't know. God, Maya. I actually tried to talk him out of pursuing partnerships, because I figured if you were representative of the local business scene, then the whole market was probably full of people living in fantasy worlds. The revelation was even worse than I'd imagined. Tyler hadn't just been dismissing my achievements to family. He'd been actively sabotaging potential business relationships in the Denver market, because of his assumptions about my failures. His lack of faith in my capabilities had led him to advise against exactly the kind of strategic partnerships that could benefit his own company. Dad was still struggling to process the basic information. Maya, are you saying you actually own a $15 million business? That all these years when we thought you were struggling to establish yourself, you were actually already successful? More than successful, Dad. Summit Ventures has been profitable since year 2. We've completed major acquisitions throughout Denver, including several properties in this downtown district. I paused, deciding to complete the revelation, including this building. Romano's is one of 3 businesses operating as tenants in a property that Summit Ventures acquired 2 years ago. The impact of this information was immediate and visible. Tyler's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. Mom gasped audibly. Dad looked around the restaurant as if seeing it for the first time. You own this building? Mom asked, her voice barely audible. Summit Ventures owns it. Yes, it was part of a portfolio acquisition focused on the downtown revitalization initiative. Romano's has been an excellent tenant, and the property has appreciated significantly since purchase. Tyler was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something mixing awe with horror and embarrassment. We're having my promotion celebration dinner in a building you own, celebrating my advancement at a company you're partnering with, while I've been telling everyone that you're an unemployed dreamer living in denial about your own mediocrity. The summary was brutal in its accuracy, but I didn't take pleasure in Tyler's obvious distress. Despite everything, I loved my brother and hadn't wanted to humiliate him. The revelation was necessary, but watching him grapple with the reality of how wrong he'd been was more painful than satisfying. There's something else you need to know about TechFlow, I said gently, realizing that the complete truth needed to come out. Summit Ventures didn't just meet with David Morrison about potential partnerships. We're already connected to TechFlow in a significant way. Tyler's expression suggested he wasn't sure he could handle any more revelations, but he needed to understand the full scope of the situation. 3 years ago, TechFlow was facing serious financial difficulties, They were looking for investors to avoid bankruptcy. Summit Ventures, operating through our subsidiary Colorado Property Holdings, invested in the company as part of our portfolio diversification strategy. I paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering the final piece of information. Summit Ventures currently owns 67% of TechFlow Solutions. We're the majority stakeholder in the company where you work, Tyler. Your promotion, your salary, your health insurance, your career prospects, they all exist because of an investment decision I made 3 years ago. The silence that followed was absolute. Tyler looked like someone had physically struck him. Mom and Dad sat frozen, clearly struggling to process information that contradicted everything they'd believed about my life and capabilities. Finally, Tyler spoke, his voice hollow. You own my company, you own the building where we're celebrating. You've been funding my career while I've been telling everyone that you're a failure. The weight of the irony seemed to crush him. Everything he'd been proud of, every achievement he'd been celebrating, every professional success he'd been building his identity around, all of it had been made possible by the sister whose business acumen he'd been questioning, and whose professional reputation he'd been undermining. I didn't know you worked there when I made the investment, I said, trying to soften the blow. It was purely coincidental that you ended up at TechFlow after we'd already become the primary stakeholder. But Tyler wasn't listening. He was staring at his hands, clearly overwhelmed by the realization that his entire professional reality had been shaped by someone he'd been treating as delusional and unsuccessful. Mom finally found her voice, though it was shaky with emotion. Maya, why didn't you tell us? All these years we've been worried about you, concerned about your future, and you've been more successful than any of us ever imagined. The hurt in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized that my secrecy had created pain beyond just misunderstanding. My parents had spent years genuinely concerned about my welfare, lying awake at night worrying about my financial stability and career prospects, when the truth was that I was more financially secure than they were. I thought I was protecting our family relationships, I said, knowing it sounded inadequate. I was afraid that money would complicate things, that you'd treat me differently, or feel uncomfortable around my success. Dad shook his head slowly. Instead, we treated you like a failure. We spent years thinking you needed our guidance and support when you were actually the most successful person in the family. The pain in his voice matched Mom's, and I realized that the revelation was hurting them as much as it was surprising them. They felt foolish for having misunderstood so completely, guilty for having dismissed my achievements, and hurt that I'd allowed them to worry unnecessarily for years. Tyler suddenly stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that drew attention from other diners. I need some air, he said, his voice tight with emotion. I need to think about this. He walked quickly toward the restaurant's entrance, leaving the three of us sitting in uncomfortable silence. Through the window I could see him pacing on the sidewalk, his phone pressed to his ear. I wondered if he was calling David Morrison, trying to figure out how to handle the professional implications of his boss's partnership discussions with his sister. Mom reached across the table and took my hand, her grip tight with emotion. Maya, I'm so sorry. We've been terrible parents, dismissing your achievements, and treating you like you needed our pity. You haven't been terrible parents, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. You were reacting to the information you had. I chose not to give you complete information, but even as I tried to absolve them of guilt, I couldn't shake the memory of Tyler's accidental phone call, the casual cruelty with which they'd discussed my supposed failures, the years of subtle condescension disguised as concern. Their intentions might have been good, but the impact had been devastating to my relationship with them. Dad was looking around the restaurant with new understanding. This is your building, you're our landlord. In a sense, the observation was accurate but strange, highlighting how many layers of irony the evening had revealed. I was celebrating Tyler's promotion in my own property, listening to my family process the discovery that everything they'd believed about my life was wrong. As we sat there trying to navigate this new reality, I realized that Tyler's revelation was just the beginning. Once my family understood the scope of my business success, everything about our relationships would change. The dynamic where they felt protective and concerned about my future would shift to something entirely different, something none of us had experience navigating. Tomorrow Tyler would have to face his boss, knowing that David Morrison had been seeking partnerships with his sister's company. My parents would have to reconcile years of worry with the reality of my financial success, and I would have to figure out how to rebuild family relationships on a foundation of truth, rather than the careful fiction I'd maintained for so long. The evening that was supposed to celebrate Tyler's modest promotion had instead become the night that changed everything we thought we knew about each other. Tyler returned to the table 20 minutes later, his face pale but composed in a way that suggested he'd spent the time on the sidewalk making difficult phone calls and processing life-altering realization. When he sat down, his entire demeanor had changed from the confident, celebratory brother who'd greeted me earlier, to someone who looked like he'd aged several years in the span of a single evening. "I called David," he said without preamble, his voice flat and professional in a way I'd never heard from him before. "I told him that Maya Chen from Summit Ventures is my sister, and that I need to recuse myself from any partnership discussions to avoid conflicts of interest." The statement was mature and responsible, exactly the kind of ethical response I'd hoped for, but hadn't expected given Tyler's obvious emotional turmoil. Despite everything that had happened between us, I felt a surge of respect for his handling of the professional complication. "How did he react?" I asked, genuinely curious about David Morrison's response to learning that his potential business partner was also his employee's sister. Tyler managed a weak smile. Shock, followed by excitement, followed by about 50 questions about why I'd never mentioned having a sister who owns a major investment firm in Denver. "I think he's more interested in moving forward with the partnership now that he knows there's a family connection that might make collaboration easier." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Tyler's family relationship with me, the very connection he'd been embarrassed about and actively concealing, had just become a professional asset that could accelerate his career advancement. The sister he'd described as a delusional wannabe entrepreneur was now positioned to help drive his company's most significant growth opportunity. Dad leaned forward, his expression mixing parental concern with newfound respect. "Tyler, what does this mean for your job? Are there ethical issues with Maya's company partnering with yours?" "Actually, it could work in everyone's favor," Tyler said, though he still looked overwhelmed by the situation. "David thinks having someone inside TechFlow who understands Summit Ventures' investment philosophy could help both companies navigate the partnership more effectively. As long as we maintain proper disclosure and avoid direct conflicts, it might actually be beneficial." Mom had been quiet since Tyler's return, but now she spoke up with the kind of maternal directness that had characterized her parenting style throughout our childhood. "We need to talk about what happened here tonight as a family. We've clearly made some serious mistakes in how we've understood and supported Maya." The statement opened floodgates I'd been trying to keep closed since the revelations began. For years I'd told myself that my family's lack of faith in my abilities didn't matter, that their opinions couldn't hurt me as long as I knew my own worth. But sitting there listening to Mom acknowledge their serious mistakes, I realized how deeply their dismissal had affected me. "It wasn't just misunderstanding," I said, my voice carrying emotions I'd been suppressing for years. "Tyler, when you accidentally called me last week, I heard you telling someone that I was an embarrassment to the family, that I was living in a fantasy world, that you were ashamed of my delusions about being successful." Tyler's face went white. "Maya, I had no idea you heard that conversation. I thought I'd hung up the phone." "You hadn't. I heard every word you said about how pathetic I was, how the family just played along with my business claims because you felt sorry for me. I heard you telling someone that Dad wanted to stage an intervention to help me accept that I should get a normal job, like normal people." The pain in my voice was unmistakable, and I watched Tyler's face crumple as he realized the full impact of his words. It was one thing to discover that his assumptions about my career had been wrong. It was another to understand that I'd heard him expressing those assumptions in the cruelest possible terms. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, tears forming in his eyes. "Maya, I had no idea. I thought I was just venting to a coworker about family concerns." "I never meant for you to hear any of that, but you meant every word you said," I replied, not trying to be cruel but needing him to understand the depth of the betrayal. You weren't exaggerating for effect or blowing off steam, you genuinely believed that I was delusional and embarrassing, and you were comfortable sharing that assessment with a colleague. Dad cleared his throat, his voice heavy with guilt. Maya, we failed you. We should have asked more questions, should have tried to understand what you were actually doing instead of making assumptions. We let our own limited experience with business and entrepreneurship color our perception of your achievement. The acknowledgement was more than I'd expected, but it also highlighted how fundamental the problem had been. My family's skepticism hadn't been based on evidence of my failures. It had been rooted in their inability to imagine that someone like me could achieve the kind of success I'd actually accomplished. The worst part, I continued, needing to get everything out while I had the courage, was realizing that you'd been humoring me for years. Every time I mentioned a business meeting or a successful deal, you were internally dismissing it as fantasy, while pretending to be supportive. You made me feel crazy for believing in my own success. Mom reached for my hand again, her grip desperate. Honey, we weren't trying to make you feel crazy. We were trying to be supportive while also being realistic about what we thought was possible for someone just starting out in business. But I wasn't just starting out, I said, pulling my hand away gently. 4 years ago, when I founded Summit Ventures, I was already experienced in real estate and investment strategy. I'd been studying the market, building relationships, preparing for exactly the kind of opportunity I eventually created. You never asked about my background or qualifications, because you'd already decided I was naive and unrealistic. Tyler spoke up, his voice thick with regret. We made assumptions based on our own limitations. None of us had ever built a business or worked in investment or real estate, so we couldn't imagine that you might actually know what you were doing. The explanation made sense, but it also revealed a deeper problem in our family dynamic. Instead of supporting my ambitions and trying to understand my goals, they'd imposed their own limited experience as the boundary for what was possible. Their love had been conditional on my conforming to their expectations of reasonable achievement. There's something else you need to understand, I said, steeling myself for the most difficult part of the conversation. When I invested in TechFlow 3 years ago, it wasn't just a random business decision. I'd been watching Tyler struggle to find stable employment, and when the opportunity arose to invest in a tech company that seemed to have good management and growth potential, I thought it might create opportunities for family members who were interested in the technology sector. Tyler's eyes widened as he processed this information. You invested in TechFlow because of me, partly. I knew you were looking for work in tech sales, and I thought that having a stable, well-funded company in Denver might create opportunities for you and others like you. When you got hired there 6 months later, I was thrilled because it seemed like everything was working out perfectly. The revelation added another layer of irony to an already complex situation. Tyler's employment at TechFlow, the job he'd been so proud of and had used as evidence of his superior work ethic, compared to my supposed lack of employment, had been made possible partly because I'd invested in the company with his career prospects in mind. You've been indirectly funding my salary and benefits for 3 years, Tyler said, his voice hollow with realization. While I've been criticizing your lack of real employment, I've been working at a company that exists because of your business decision. I never wanted you to know that, I admitted. I wanted you to succeed on your own merits, to build your career based on your own talents and efforts. The investment was meant to create opportunities, not to make you dependent on my financial support. Dad was shaking his head slowly, clearly struggling to reconcile everything he'd learned with his previous understanding of our family dynamics. Maya, do you realize what this means? While we've been worrying about your financial stability and career prospects, you've been the most financially stable person in the family. You've been in a position to help all of us, but we never knew because we were too busy dismissing your achievement. The observation was accurate but painful for everyone involved. My parents had spent years feeling protective and concerned about my future when the reality was that I was probably in a better position to help them than they were to help me. The reversal of perceived power dynamics was disorienting for all of us. Mom looked around the restaurant again, her expression mixing wonder with embarrassment. You own this building. You've probably been watching us have family dinners in your property for years, listening to us worry about your career while sitting in a business you own. Actually, this is the first time I've eaten here since acquiring the property. I generally avoid mixing my business properties with personal activities, but the irony wasn't lost on me when Tyler chose this location for his celebration dinner. The evening had taken on a surreal quality, with each new revelation adding layers of complexity to relationships I'd thought I understood completely. My family was grappling not just with the discovery of my business success, but with the realization that their perception of our entire family structure had been fundamentally incorrect. Tyler suddenly looked up with an expression of dawning horror. Maya, all those times I complained about work stress, or mentioned financial concerns about rent and student loans, you could have helped immediately. You were probably sitting there knowing you could solve my problems without it even impacting your budget. The observation hit harder than he probably intended. There had indeed been countless occasions when Tyler had mentioned financial stress or career concerns that I could have addressed easily, but I'd remained silent because revealing my ability to help would have required explaining my business success. I'd watched my brother struggle with problems I could have solved, prioritizing my privacy over his welfare. I wanted you to build your own success, I said, but the words sounded hollow even to me. I was afraid that if I helped too much or too obviously, it would undermine your confidence or make you dependent on my financial support. Instead, you let me struggle unnecessarily while you secretly funded the company that eventually employed me. Tyler replied, not with anger but with a kind of resigned amazement at the complexity of the situation. The conversation was interrupted by our server, who approached with professional discretion to check on our table. The celebration dinner we'd ordered hours earlier sat largely untouched, the food having grown cold while we navigated revelations that had fundamentally altered our understanding of each other. Can we get the check, please? I asked, realizing that attempting to continue the meal would be pointless, given the emotional intensity of our conversation. As the server walked away, Tyler spoke again, his voice thoughtful. David wants to schedule a formal meeting next week to discuss the partnership details. He's asked me to participate as the liaison between TechFlow and Summit Ventures, since I understand both companies' cultures and objectives. The irony of Tyler becoming the bridge between his sister's company and his own employer was almost too perfect, but it also represented a potential path forward for all of us. Instead of continuing to navigate the complicated emotions around years of misunderstanding, we could focus on building a professional relationship that acknowledged our new reality. That sounds like a good opportunity for both companies, I said, and for your career development. Partnership liaisons often gain valuable experience in strategic planning and business development. Tyler nodded, but his expression remained serious. Maya, I need you to know that I'm going to do everything I can to make this partnership successful, not because you're my sister but because it's the right thing for both companies. I don't want anyone to think I'm getting special treatment because of our family connection. The statement showed maturity and professionalism that I respected, but it also highlighted how much our relationship had changed in the span of a single evening. We'd gone from siblings with completely different perceived levels of success to potential business colleagues, navigating family dynamics in a professional context. Dad leaned back in his chair, looking exhausted by the evening's revelation. I don't think any of us knows how to process all of this. We need time to understand what it means for our family going forward. He was right. The discovery that their assumptions about my life had been completely wrong wasn't something my family could absorb immediately. They needed time to reconcile their memory of years of concern and guidance with the reality that I'd been more successful than any of them had imagined. When the check arrived, I reached for it automatically, but Tyler put his hand over mine. Maya, I invited everyone to celebrate my promotion. This dinner is my responsibility. Tyler, you don't need to worry about the cost, I said gently, understanding his need to maintain some independence despite everything we'd learned. It's not about the money, he replied. It's about taking responsibility for my choices and maintaining some normalcy in our relationship despite everything that's changed tonight. I nodded and let him handle the check, recognizing that he needed to preserve his sense of agency and independence even as we all adjusted to our new understanding of family dynamics. As we prepared to leave Romano's, I realized that the evening had accomplished something I'd never intended but desperately needed. For years I'd been living a double life, successful in business but perceived as failing by my family. The revelation had been painful for everyone involved, but it had also freed me from the exhausting burden of pretending to be less than I was. Walking out of the restaurant I owned, with family members who finally understood my actual accomplishments, felt like stepping into a completely different life. The relationships would be complicated going forward, requiring all of us to navigate new dynamics around money, success, and family obligations, but they would also be based on truth rather than the careful fiction I'd maintained for years. Tyler stopped at the entrance and turned to face me directly. Maya, I want you to know that discovering the truth about your success doesn't just make me proud of what you've accomplished, it makes me ashamed of how I've treated you and how little faith I've had in your ability. You deserved better from your family, and I'm going to spend a long time making up for my mistakes. The apology was more than I'd expected and more than I'd known I needed. For the first time in years, I felt like my brother was seeing me clearly, acknowledging not just my achievements, but the impact of his long-term dismissal of those achievements. We're all going to need time to figure out how to rebuild our relationships based on who we actually are rather than who we thought we were, I said. But I think tonight was a necessary start to that process. As we walked to our cars in the Denver evening air, I realized that Tyler's celebration dinner had become something entirely different than any of us had planned. Instead of celebrating his modest promotion, we'd discovered that our entire family structure was built on fundamental misunderstanding. Instead of reinforcing Tyler's position as the successful sibling, the evening had revealed that success in our family was distributed very differently than anyone had realized. The next few months would require all of us to rebuild relationships based on truth rather than assumption, to navigate new dynamics around money and achievement, and to figure out how to maintain family bonds while acknowledging dramatically different levels of professional success. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be real in a way our relationships hadn't been for years. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of Summit Ventures, watching Tyler present partnership proposals to a room full of Denver business leaders. The TechFlow collaboration had exceeded everyone's expectations, generating opportunities neither company could have achieved independently. Tyler had earned respect in both organizations through his strategic thinking and relationship management skills, building a career that was authentically his own despite its foundation on my earlier investment. Our family dinners had become more honest, but also more complicated, with my parents still adjusting to having a daughter whose business success exceeded their ability to offer guidance or support. But the relationships were genuine now, based on who we actually were rather than who we'd pretended to be or assumed each other to be. The evening at Romano's had changed everything, revealing that sometimes the family member everyone underestimates is actually the one who's been supporting everyone else all along. But more importantly, it had taught all of us that love and respect require truth, even when that truth challenges everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you. The week following our revelation dinner brought a series of conversations that felt like carefully choreographed damage control mixed with genuine attempts at understanding. Each family member seemed to be processing the information differently, reaching out at unexpected moments with questions that revealed just how deeply our assumptions about each other had been embedded in our daily interactions. Monday morning started with a text from Mom at 6:30 a.m. Maya, I couldn't sleep thinking about how many times I asked if you needed money for groceries or bills. I feel sick knowing you were probably spending more on lunch than I thought you made in a week. Can we talk to? The message encapsulated the strange mixture of guilt and wonder that seemed to characterize everyone's reactions. My family was simultaneously impressed by my success and horrified by their own blindness to it. Every past interaction was being re-examined through the lens of new information, and most of those re-examinations were making them feel foolish or insensitive. I called Mom during my lunch break, expecting a brief conversation but ending up on the phone for nearly 2 hours, as she walked through years of moments that had taken on new meaning. The time she'd given me her old winter coat because she thought I couldn't afford a new one, not knowing I'd just closed a deal worth more than her annual salary. The Christmas when she'd quietly put extra money in my card because she was worried about my financial stability, while I was debating whether to buy them a car to replace Dad's aging Honda. The worst part, she said, her voice thick with emotion, is realizing how condescending we must have seemed. All those times we tried to give you career advice or suggested you consider more stable employment, you must have wanted to scream at us. The truth was more complicated than that. There had indeed been moments when their well-meaning guidance had felt insulting, but there had also been times when I'd wondered if they might be right, if I was being reckless or unrealistic in my business ambition. Their lack of faith had sometimes made me doubt myself, which was perhaps more damaging than their condescension. Tuesday brought a different kind of conversation when Tyler appeared at my office without an appointment, looking like he hadn't slept since our dinner. Rachel announced his presence with barely concealed curiosity, clearly wondering why my brother was requesting meetings rather than just calling like a normal sibling. "I've been thinking about this for 3 days straight," Tyler said, as soon as he sat down across from my desk. "I need to understand something. When David Morrison came here last week to discuss partnerships, and you knew he was my boss, what were you thinking? Were you planning to tell me about the meeting?" The question had been bothering me too. In the moment, I'd been so focused on managing the immediate situation that I hadn't fully considered the ethical implications of taking a business meeting with my brother's supervisor without disclosing our family relationship. Honestly, I was caught off guard by his visit, I admit. He requested the meeting through normal business channels, and I didn't know who he was until he introduced himself. "Once I realized he was your boss, I should have disclosed our relationship immediately, but I was afraid it would create complications for you at work." Tyler nodded slowly, processing my explanation. "David asked me yesterday if I thought your failure to mention our family connection was intentional deception, or just awkward timing. I told him I thought it was probably the latter, but I wasn't entirely sure. The fact that my professional reputation was being evaluated based on family dynamics I'd been trying to avoid was exactly the kind of complication I'd feared when I started keeping my business life separate from family relationships. But the alternative, explaining Tyler's long-standing dismissal of my career, would have been even more awkward for everyone involved. "What did you tell David about why I'd never mentioned my business to the family?" I asked, curious about how Tyler was handling the professional implication. "I told him the truth," Tyler said, though his expression suggested that truth had been uncomfortable to share. "I explained that you'd wanted to keep business and family separate, and that we'd been too quick to dismiss your career claims without investigating them properly. I took responsibility for the family's lack of awareness, rather than making it seem like you'd been deliberately secretive." The response showed more maturity than I'd expected, and probably more generosity toward me than I deserved, given the circumstance. Tyler was protecting my professional reputation even though doing so required acknowledging his own poor judgment about my capabilities. Wednesday brought the most unexpected development when Dad showed up at my apartment building, standing in the lobby with a bouquet of flowers and an expression of nervous determination that reminded me of his demeanor when he'd been preparing to ask for my permission to marry Mom decades early. "I need to apologize properly," he said without preamble as I let him into my apartment, "and I need to understand what I missed, what signs I should have seen that you were building something significant." The conversation that followed was unlike any discussion Dad and I had ever had. Instead of offering paternal guidance or expressing concern about my choices, he asked detailed questions about my business development process, my decision-making criteria, and my long-term strategic planning. For the first time in my adult life, he was treating me as someone whose professional judgment he respected and wanted to understand. "I worked in manufacturing for 35 years, he said at one point, "and I thought that gave me enough business experience to evaluate your career prospects. But everything you've accomplished requires knowledge and skills I never developed. I was judging your potential based on my own limitations, rather than your actual capabilities." The admission was more honest than I'd expected, and more painful than he probably realized. Dad's skepticism hadn't just been about doubting my business claims, it had been rooted in his inability to imagine success beyond his own experience. His love had been constrained by his own limitations, and that constraint had shaped every interaction we'd had about my career. As he prepared to leave, Dad paused at my apartment door and looked around with new awareness. "This place isn't small because you can't afford better, is it? You chose it because it meets your needs without unnecessary expense." Location, security, and convenience were more important to me than size or luxury, I confirmed. "I spend most of my time at the office anyway, so elaborate living space felt like an inefficient use of resources." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly the kind of practical thinking that probably contributed to your business success, and we interpreted it as evidence that you were struggling financially." Thursday's surprise came in the form of a lunch invitation from Uncle Danny, who had apparently been getting regular updates from Dad about the family revelation. Unlike my immediate family, Danny seemed more amused than guilty about the situation, perhaps because his own relationship with me hadn't been built around concerns about my career prospects. "I always wondered why you seemed so uninterested in talking about work at family gatherings," he said over sandwiches at a downtown deli. "Most people love bragging about their achievements, but you always deflected when anyone asked about your business activity." "I was afraid that if I talked about my success, it would either seem like bragging or create expectations that would complicate family relationships," I explained. Danny laughed, but not unkindly. "Instead, you created a situation where everyone thought you were lying about your success. You managed to achieve the worst possible outcome for someone trying to maintain family harmony around money." His assessment was accurate and oddly comforting. Danny had always been the family member most willing to point out uncomfortable truths, and his perspective helped me understand that my strategy had been flawed from the beginning rather than just poorly executed. "The funny thing is," he continued, "Tyler spent half of last Sunday's family barbecue telling everyone about his sister, the successful businesswoman, like he'd always been your biggest supporter." The cognitive dissonance was incredible to watch. The image of Tyler suddenly repositioning himself as my champion after years of dismissing my achievements was both irritating and understandable. People rarely want to admit that their judgment has been fundamentally wrong, especially when that admission requires acknowledging they've treated someone poorly based on incorrect assumptions. Friday brought the week's most significant development when David Morrison called to request a formal meeting between Summit Ventures and TechFlow's executive team. The partnership discussions had accelerated dramatically once the family connection was disclosed, partly because David now felt he better understood the cultural compatibility between our organizations. "Having Tyler as our internal liaison has been incredibly valuable," David explained during our phone call. "He understands both companies' approaches to client relationships and strategic planning in ways that most partnership coordinators would." The irony that Tyler's dismissal of my business acumen had positioned him to become the bridge between our companies wasn't lost on me, but I was genuinely impressed by how quickly he'd adapted to his new role. The weekly reports he'd been sending showed sophisticated understanding of both organizations' strengths and potential synergy. The formal partnership meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, which meant I'd be sitting across a conference table from Tyler in a professional context for the first time in our lives. The prospect was both exciting and nerve-wracking, representing a complete reversal of our sibling dynamics and potentially the foundation for a new kind of relationship built on mutual professional respect. Weekend conversations with Jennifer Walsh, my financial advisor, helped me process the week's emotional complexity, while also planning for the business implications of increased family awareness about my success. Jennifer had been my confidant throughout Summit Ventures' development, and she was the only person who fully understood both my business achievements and my family relationship challenges. "You realize this changes everything about your financial privacy," she pointed out during our Saturday morning coffee meeting. "Once your family knows about Summit Ventures, they'll inevitably learn about your other investments and hold it. Are you prepared for them to understand the full scope of your wealth?" The question had been nagging at me all week. Revealing Summit Ventures was just the beginning of potential disclosures about my financial situation. My family now knew I owned a successful investment company, but they had no idea about my stock portfolio, my real estate holdings outside the business, or my personal net worth that extended far beyond Summit Ventures' assets. I think I need to have a comprehensive conversation with them about my financial situation, especially since Tyler's now involved in your business operations. He's going to encounter information about Summit Ventures' portfolio and investment strategies that will give him insights into your personal wealth, whether you intend to share that information or not. The weekend also brought an unexpected visit from Tyler, who appeared at my apartment Sunday morning with coffee and pastries from a bakery I recognized as being located in another building I owned through one of my investment entities. The coincidence felt like the universe's way of highlighting how interconnected my financial interests were with locations my family frequented regularly. "I've been thinking about our conversation on Tuesday," Tyler said as we settled in my living room, "about the ethics of business meetings and family relationships. I realize I've been approaching this backwards." I waited for him to continue, unsure where his thoughts were leading. Instead of wondering whether you should have disclosed our relationship to David, I should be asking why I never bothered to investigate your business claims thoroughly enough to know you were someone David would want to partner with. The observation was more insightful than I'd expected, and got to the heart of what had gone wrong in our family dynamic. Rather than supporting my ambitions and trying to understand my goals, they'd dismissed them without investigation, and then felt betrayed when their assumptions proved incorrect. I spent years telling people you were living in a fantasy about business success, Tyler continued, when the reality was that I was living in a fantasy about your failure. I created an elaborate story about your lack of achievements to justify my own lack of interest in understanding what you were actually doing. The admission was more honest than anything he'd said since our dinner revelation, and it helped me understand that his dismissal of my career hadn't been based on evidence but on assumptions that protected him from feeling threatened by my success. Acknowledging my achievements would have required examining his own more modest accomplishments, so it had been easier to dismiss mine as fictional. Sunday evening brought a family dinner invitation that felt like a test of whether we could maintain normal relationships despite everything that had changed. Mom had suggested meeting at Romano's again, either as a gesture of support for my business interests or because she wanted to experience the restaurant with full awareness of my ownership. Sitting in the same booth where our world had shifted just a week earlier, we attempted to have a normal family conversation that acknowledged our new reality without constantly referencing the dramatic revelations. It was awkward at first, with everyone seeming hyper-aware of their words and careful not to make assumptions about anyone's financial situation or career prospects. But gradually, the conversation settled into something that felt both familiar and fundamentally different. Dad asked genuine questions about my business development strategies rather than offering unsolicited advice about career stability. Mom shared updates about her part-time work without the underlying concern that I might need guidance about employment. Tyler discussed his role in the upcoming partnership meetings with professional enthusiasm rather than defensive pride. For the first time in years, I felt like I was having dinner with people who saw me clearly, who understood both my achievements and my limitations without the filter of misplaced concern or misguided assumption. The relationships were more honest but also more complex, requiring all of us to navigate new dynamics around success, money, and family obligations. As we prepared to leave Romano's for the second time in a week, Tyler pulled me aside with an expression of serious determination. "Maya, I want you to know that discovering the truth about your success has changed more than just my understanding of your career. It's made me realize that I need to approach all my relationships with more curiosity and less assumption." The statement suggested that our family's experience might have broader implications for how Tyler approached professional and personal relationships, which was perhaps the most positive outcome possible from an otherwise painful series of revelations. Monday morning brought a call from David Morrison with news that would have seemed impossible just 2 weeks earlier. "Maya, I've been discussing the partnership opportunity with our board, and they're excited about the potential for comprehensive collaboration between our company. They'd like to explore not just project-specific partnerships, but potentially having Summit Ventures become a strategic investor in TechFlow's expansion plan. The proposal would deepen my financial involvement with Tyler's company while also creating opportunities for him to advance into more senior roles within an organization that was performing well, partly due to my strategic guidance." The situation was becoming even more complex, but also potentially more beneficial for everyone involved. Tuesday's partnership meeting exceeded all expectations, with Tyler demonstrating sophisticated understanding of both companies' strategic objectives and facilitating discussions that led to preliminary agreements worth several $1 million. Watching my brother command respect in a room full of senior business executives while knowing that his employment at the company was originally made possible by my investment created a strange mixture of pride and irony. After the meeting, as Tyler and I walked to our cars in the parking garage beneath the building I owned, he stopped and turned to face me with an expression of genuine gratitude mixed with lingering amazement. 6 months ago, I was telling everyone that my sister was an unemployed dreamer living in denial about her own mediocrity, he said. Today, I just helped to negotiate a partnership between her company and mine that could define both our careers for the next decade. The universe has a seriously twisted sense of humor. The observation perfectly captured the surreal nature of our journey from mutual misunderstanding to professional collaboration. We'd gone from siblings with completely different perceived levels of success to business partners navigating family dynamics in a corporate context. As I drove home through downtown Denver, passing properties I owned and businesses I'd invested in, I realized that the revelation dinner at Romano's had accomplished something I'd never intended but desperately needed. For years I'd been successful in business, but perceived as failing by the people whose opinions mattered most to me. The discovery had been painful for everyone involved, but it had also freed all of us from the exhausting burden of maintaining relationships based on fundamental misunderstanding. The future would require careful navigation of new dynamics around money, success, and family obligations, but it would also be built on truth rather than the careful fiction I'd maintained for years. My family finally saw me clearly, understood my actual accomplishments, and treated me with the respect my achievements had earned. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate planning or dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's simply allowing people to discover that the family member they've been underestimating has actually been the most successful person in the room all along. 3 months after the partnership agreements were signed, I found myself standing in the conference room of Summit Ventures' newly expanded offices, watching Tyler deliver a presentation to a room full of potential investors that would have been impossible to imagine just 6 months earlier. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from finally understanding your place in the world and the value you bring to complex situations. The presentation focused on integrated technology solutions for commercial real estate development, a niche market that had emerged from our company's collaboration. Tyler had identified opportunities that neither Summit Ventures nor TechFlow had recognized independently, demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that had impressed investors from across the Colorado business community. As I listened to him field sophisticated questions about market analysis and implementation timelines, I reflected on how dramatically our relationship had evolved. The brother who had once dismissed my business acumen as elaborate fantasy was now my most trusted partner in developing innovative approaches to investment and technology integration. The irony was no longer painful. It had become the foundation for something neither of us could have built alone. The success of our partnership had attracted attention from business publications throughout the region, with Colorado Business Magazine featuring a cover story about the sibling success story that's reshaping Denver's investment landscape. The article had been Tyler's idea, his way of publicly acknowledging both my achievements and his previous misconceptions about them. During the interview, Tyler had been remarkably candid about our family dynamics and his own journey from skepticism to collaboration. I spent years convinced that my sister was living in a fantasy world about business success, he'd told the reporter. It turned out I was the one living in a fantasy, just a different kind. I'd created an elaborate story about her failures to avoid examining my own assumptions about what success looks like. The quote had generated significant discussion in Denver's business community, partly because it challenged conventional wisdom about family dynamics and professional relationships. Most people expected family members to either support each other unconditionally or compete destructively, but our experience suggested a third possibility: transformation through honest confrontation with uncomfortable truth. The media attention had also created unexpected opportunities for speaking engagements and consulting work. Business schools were interested in our story as a case study in strategic partnerships and family business dynamics. Professional organizations wanted us to discuss integration challenges and collaborative problem solving. The demand for our perspectives had become another revenue stream, one that neither of us had anticipated when we first started working together. But perhaps the most significant development had been the evolution of our entire family's understanding of success, achievement, and mutual support. The revelation about my business had forced all of us to examine assumptions we'd held not just about each other, but about ourselves and our own potential for growth and change. Dad had enrolled in a business management course at the local community college, explaining that he wanted to better understand the concepts Tyler and I discussed during family dinner. At 68, he was determined to develop knowledge that would allow him to offer meaningful perspectives on our work rather than well-intentioned but uninformed advice. I realized that my lack of business education had limited my ability to support my children's ambitions. He'd explained during one of our weekly coffee meetings, "I can't change the past, but I can make sure I'm better equipped to understand your achievements going forward." His dedication to learning had been touching and impressive, but it had also highlighted how our family's limitations had created barriers to understanding that went beyond simple skepticism. Dad's inability to envision success beyond his own experience hadn't been malicious. It had been constrained by knowledge gaps he was now working to address. Mom had taken a different approach to processing our family's transformation, focusing on the emotional and relational aspects of what we'd all experienced. She'd started seeing a counselor to work through her feelings about the years of misplaced concern and misguided attempts to help me manage what she'd perceived as unrealistic career expectations. "I thought I was being a good mother by trying to protect you from disappointment," she'd told me during a particularly emotional conversation. "I never considered that I might be protecting you from your own success by refusing to believe it was possible." Her therapy sessions had led to insights that benefited all of us, particularly around communication patterns and assumption-making that had characterized our family interactions for years. She'd learned to ask questions rather than making statements, to seek understanding rather than offering immediate advice, and to recognize when her concerns might be based on her own limitations rather than actual problems. The changes in our family dynamics had been gradual but profound, creating space for relationships based on who we actually were rather than who we'd assumed each other to be. Family gatherings had become more honest but also more comfortable, with everyone feeling free to discuss their actual experiences rather than managing perceived expectations or concerns. Tyler's professional growth had been accelerated by our partnership, but it had also been deepened by his willingness to examine and change patterns of thinking that had limited his perspective for years. The success he was experiencing now wasn't just about working for a thriving company. It was about developing capabilities he'd never known he possessed. "Working with Maya has taught me that my assumptions about people's potential, including my own, were based on incredibly limited information," he'd told David Morrison during a recent performance review. "I've learned to approach every professional relationship with more curiosity and less judgment, which has improved my effectiveness with clients and colleagues." David had shared this feedback with me during one of our quarterly partnership reviews, noting that Tyler's development had exceeded everyone's expectations and was contributing to improved team dynamics throughout TechFlow. The ripple effects of our family revelation were creating positive changes that extended far beyond our immediate relationship. The financial implications of our collaboration had also exceeded projections, with the integrated services model generating revenue streams that had attracted interest from investors outside Colorado. National investment firms were beginning to explore similar partnerships between technology companies and regional investment groups, using our model as a template for expansion into emerging markets. Jennifer Walsh had been instrumental in managing the increased complexity of my financial portfolio as Summit Ventures grew and diversified. The success of the TechFlow partnership had created opportunities for similar collaborations with other technology companies, requiring sophisticated analysis of market trends and competitive positioning. "You've essentially created a new category of investment services," Jennifer had observed during our most recent strategy session. "The combination of local market knowledge, technology integration, and family business dynamics has produced results that traditional investment firms and technology companies can't replicate independently." The observation had led to discussions about scaling our approach, potentially expanding to other markets where similar opportunities might exist. But it had also raised questions about whether the personal elements that made our partnership successful could be replicated in purely professional context. Tyler and I had spent considerable time discussing this challenge, recognizing that our family history and the dramatic process of discovery that had brought us together created unique dynamics that couldn't be easily duplicated. The trust we'd developed had been forged through shared vulnerability and mutual recognition of past mistakes, elements that would be difficult to manufacture in traditional business relationships. These conversations had led to a decision that surprised both of us. We wanted to continue working together exclusively rather than attempting to scale our model through other partnerships. The success we'd achieved was valuable, but the relationship we'd built was irreplaceable, and we were reluctant to dilute either by pursuing growth that might compromise the personal foundation of our professional collaboration. The decision had financial implications, as it meant turning down lucrative opportunities for expansion, but it reflected priorities that had evolved through our experience of rebuilding family relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can build isn't the biggest or most profitable, it's the most authentic and sustainable. This philosophy had influenced other aspects of my business strategy as well. Summit Ventures had received acquisition offers from larger investment firms interested in our innovative approaches and strong performance record. The offers had been financially attractive, but accepting them would have meant losing the independence and flexibility that had made our success possible. Instead of selling, I'd chosen to maintain Summit Ventures as a privately held company focused on selective, high-quality investments rather than rapid growth or maximum scale. The decision had allowed us to preserve the personal relationships and community connections that had been central to our achievements while avoiding the pressures and compromises that often accompany external investment or corporate acquisition. Tyler had supported this choice enthusiastically, recognizing that our partnership's effectiveness depended on maintaining the values and approaches that had created our initial success. His own career development had benefited from working within an organization that prioritized relationship quality over transaction volume, allowing him to develop expertise and reputation based on meaningful client outcomes rather than short-term revenue maximization. The speaking engagements and consulting opportunities had also allowed both of us to contribute to discussions about business ethics, family dynamics, and sustainable success models. We'd discovered that our story resonated with audiences who were grappling with similar challenges around balancing personal relationships with professional ambition. One particularly memorable presentation had been to a group of family business owners who were struggling with succession planning and intergenerational communication. Our experience of overcoming fundamental mental misunderstandings about each other's capabilities and intentions had provided insights that helped other families navigate complex dynamics around money, power, and mutual support. The most important lesson we learned, Tyler had told the audience, is that love and respect require truth, even when that truth challenges everything you thought you knew about the people closest to you. We spent years protecting each other from realities that, once acknowledged, actually strengthened our relationships and created opportunities none of us could have achieved independently. The presentation had generated follow-up consulting requests from families dealing with similar challenges, creating another dimension to our professional work that felt deeply meaningful. Helping other people avoid the years of misunderstanding we'd experienced had become a natural extension of our own healing and growth process. As autumn approached, marking nearly a year since our dramatic dinner revelation, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had led from Tyler's accidental phone call to our current collaboration. The transformation had been painful at times, requiring all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about our assumptions and limitations. But it had also created possibilities that none of us could have imagined when we were operating from false premises about each other's capabilities and intention. The success we'd built together wasn't just measured in financial returns or professional recognition, though both had exceeded our expectations. It was measured in the quality of relationships that had been rebuilt on foundations of truth and mutual respect, in the personal growth that had resulted from honest examination of our own limitations and biases, and in the opportunities we'd created to help others navigate similar challenges. Looking ahead, our plans focused on deepening rather than expanding our collaboration, developing expertise and reputation based on consistent excellence rather than rapid growth. We'd learned that the most sustainable success comes from understanding your strengths and limitations clearly, building relationships based on authentic communication, and choosing opportunities that align with your values rather than simply maximizing short-term gain. The story that had begun with Tyler's dismissive comments about my supposed failures had evolved into something neither of us could have anticipated. A genuine partnership built on mutual respect, complementary skill, and shared commitment to helping others achieve success through honest relationships and strategic thinking. On a crisp October evening, as I walked through downtown Denver past buildings I owned and businesses I'd invested in, I realized that the most important transformation hadn't been my family's recognition of my business success. It had been all of us learning to see each other clearly, to communicate honestly about our experiences and aspirations, and to support each other's growth rather than limiting each other through misplaced assumption. The revelation dinner at Romano's had changed everything, but not in the way any of us had expected. Instead of proving that I was more successful than my family had realized, it had proved that we were all more capable of growth, understanding, and authentic relationship than we'd given ourselves credit for. Sometimes the best outcome isn't getting the recognition you deserve for achievements you've already accomplished. Sometimes it's discovering that the people you care about most are capable of seeing you clearly, supporting your ambitions genuinely, and growing alongside you in ways that create opportunities none of you could have achieved alone. The family that had once pitied my supposed delusions about business success had become my most trusted advisors and strongest supporters. The brother who had dismissed my achievements as elaborate fantasies had become my most valued professional partner. The parents who had worried about my financial stability had become proud advocates for the company I'd built and the values that guided my approach to business and relationships. Tyler's boss, recognizing me as the CEO who owned everything, had been the catalyst for revelation, but the real transformation had been much deeper and more valuable than any single moment of vindication could have provided. We'd all learned that love requires truth, that support requires understanding, and that the strongest relationships are built on clear seeing rather than comfortable assumptions. The success we'd achieved together was meaningful not just because of what we'd accomplished, but because of who we'd become in the process of accomplishing it. And that transformation, unlike any business achievement, was something that would continue to create value and opportunity for all of us for years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.